Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Craig Boyce, the Dean of Syracuse University College of Law, and I want to thank you this afternoon for joining me for the second annual lecture and panel discussion on the current term of the United States Supreme Court, presented by experts in Supreme Court and constitutional law matters. Again, this year we have partnered with the Federal Court Bar Association to put together this event, and we're very appreciative of their partnership with us. Many of you have heard me say it. I believe that it is essential that the College of Law be engaged with our community of bar associations, whose members, including some of our own alumni, are interacting daily with the law at all levels. Those interactions inform and fuel much of the work that we do here in Dineen Hall, and their experiences keep us current. I'm looking forward to this afternoon's program as a fascinating, timely, and robust discussion of a busy and possibly groundbreaking 2018 Supreme Court term. Certainly, it's been much in the news in the last 24 hours, and we're looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say more about the court's term rather than the immediate events. But in any event, before I introduce our first speaker, I want to acknowledge the Institute for the Study of the Judiciary, Politics, and the Media. IJPM is the first of its kind institute devoted to the interdisciplinary study of issues at the intersection of law, politics, and the media. And I want to acknowledge my colleague and the College of Law Vice Dean, Keith Bybee, who is also the Paul E. and the Honorable Joanne Alper Judiciary Studies Professor, and he directs IJPM. Thank you, Keith, for serving as the moderator of today's program. And thank you, Professor Golden, Lauren Golden, for leading the production of today's program on behalf of the College of Law. Dahlia Lithwick is a senior editor at Slate, and in that capacity writes the Supreme Court Dispatches and jurisprudence columns. She also hosts the biweekly podcast Amicus. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Commentary, among other places. She won a 2013 National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act, and she's been twice awarded an Online Journalism Award for her legal commentary, and was the first online journalist invited to be on the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. She received the 2017 Golden Pen Award from the Legal Writing Institute, and she's testified before Congress about access to justice issues in the era of the Roberts Court. And she's appeared on CNN, ABC, The Colbert Report, and is a frequent guest on The Rachel Maddow Show. Ms. Lithwick earned her BA from Yale University, her JD from Stanford, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome her to Dineen Hall and to introduce her this afternoon as our featured lecturer.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Can folks hear me in the back? Okay. I'm going to start my remarks with just the precatory caution that I was in that Dirksen chamber all day yesterday and got on a plane leaving DC at, I think, 1 a.m. and arrived here at 2. And based on yesterday's extraordinary hearings, I rewrote my whole speech at 5 this morning. And then when I looked at what was happening in the last half hour, I started rewriting it again, which is simply to say, please don't expect my remarks to be frozen in amber, because there's a non-trivial chance that by the time I'm done speaking in 40 minutes, the whole world will have changed again and everything I said is obsolete. But I really want to thank Keith and Lauren and IJPM. I've been such a fan of the work that you all have been doing here, and I've so many times enjoyed coming and sort of living at this, I think, incredibly amazing intersection of journalism and law, and I can't imagine a place I'd rather try to process whatever it is that is happening in the judicial branch than here with you today. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about my topic, the court in transition, one reporter's perspective, and then I think I'll just leave a bunch of time to try to answer questions, because the truth is I am as mystified by the events of the last month on the Judiciary Committee, as many of you. So I want to start by just saying that I've been covering the Supreme Court. This is my 19th year, and I am still one of the young'uns on the beat, because there are people who've been on that beat for 37 and 38 years. It's the best job in the world, even after a day like yesterday, and not one that I would change. But I do think that our very job descriptions right now are in turmoil. Every other time I've spoken about my job, I've talked about the sort of central tension of the last 2 decades, which has been the advent of new media, the world of Twitter, the Supreme Court, and its real resistance to having a meaningful and functional relationship with the press, and all the ways in which you kind of come to the court importuning them to give you a little bit more than you're getting, which is exactly what you were getting in 1850 when you were covering the court. And that is actually, I think, not the central challenge I want to talk about, although I'm happy to take questions about how just deeply strange it is to continue to cover an institution that takes your phone and your computer away from you as you walk in the building, and if you take anything more than one pad and one pen, they take it away from you. I'm sure I've told the story before, but my first year covering the Supreme Court for Slate, before I knew you weren't allowed to take printed matter into the press area of the Supreme Court, they confiscated my copy of Kafka's The Trial, which I had brought in for a little light reading before oral arguments. And when I got into a very earnest conversation with the marshal about the meaning of irony, he took my book away forever. It's a very strange thing to try to cover, particularly for an online website, the Supreme Court. And I would also note, I think when I first started coming and talking here, Keith will remember better than me, but I used to say, it's so crazy, everybody else files their story at 6 o'clock at night for the next morning, and I'm expected to file at 3 p.m. after a 10 a.m. argument, and now I'm just the old geezer who says, these little kids from BuzzFeed are tweeting out oral argument before I can even turn on my laptop. So in the course of my 20 years, I've gone from being the young, hip, edgy kid to being this fossil who can barely figure out how to work Twitter, which Justice Breyer adorably calls the tweeter. So with that as my sort of hedge against, I know that there are a lot of amazing journalism questions, I want to ask the meta question of how Supreme Court reporters, particularly after the events of this last summer and the Judge Kavanaugh nomination, are going to continue to do the work that we do. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about some of the traditions, at least at the Supreme Court press corps. It's a tiny little press corps, and it's shrunken considerably since I started on this beat. When I started on this beat, I think there were 70-some credentialed reporters who usually came for arguments, and now it's down to 40-some, and there are almost entirely, with very few exceptions, no online reporters, and the credentialing system is its own mystical system that nobody has been able to penetrate, but I was very lucky that I was able early on to become the first online person accredited at the Supreme Court, and for some time after, and the nice press office called me the barbarian at the gate and didn't credential anyone for a few years because of me. But I think that it's really important to establish that the Supreme Court has such unique and entrenched traditions around its journalism. And some of it is adorable, some of it is just, it's just so funny that we can only take a pen and a paper, and it's so funny that we can't record anything. It's funny that we can't We get transcripts, very speedy compared to the old days, transcripts, but we can only use limited amounts of them until the actual transcript is posted. So we have all these tools to ostensibly make our lives a little bit easier, but none of them are really what we want, which is just to have audio or at least video in the chamber. But we do our best, and then I think I've also talked before just about the utter strangeness of on big argument days when they make you line up in the corridor outside the court, and you're literally ranked in order of your importance. So, just to be super clear, I'm a C7, and A1 is Nina Totenberg, so I just want you to absolutely know without any dispute how important I am in the world. But then they actually march you into the court, with the A's 1 through 12 and the B's 1 through 12, and you have to walk on a line, which I have likened to my kids in kindergarten when they had to walk to the park on a rope, and the kids at the back are the really bad ones. So I'm probably not going to creep much higher than C7 in my career, and you should invite Nina back next year so you can hear from the A1 people. But I will say that just the level of convention and rigid decorum is not just about how we behave and conduct ourselves and when we can go in and who we can talk to and what we can do in the court, but I think it really does inflect on the reverence with which the press corps at the Supreme Court tends to cover the proceedings. And there are a few, I think, reasonable criticisms of the Supreme Court press corps as a whole, and I'll run through them. I think that the first one, and I think probably David Margolick has written about this more pointedly than most people, is that we're just credulous scribes, that we just go in and we take dictation, and whatever the justices say, we write down, and we're barely reporters, and there are never any scoops, and we don't probe for deep and interesting stories, that all we do is write down what the justices say, and preferably in fawning ways, because all we want is access. And that's not entirely an unreasonable critique. It is certainly not a press corps that is apt to, root through dumpsters looking for dirt. I think it's probably no accident that to the extent that there were scoops on the Brett Kavanaugh story in the last 3 weeks, almost none of them came from Supreme Court reporters or even legal reporters. They came from, sort of a cadre of what I'm starting to think of as the Me Too reporters, like Jane Mayer and Ronan Farrow, but they also came from just enterprising reporters at places like BuzzFeed and The Intercept, who are not people who cover the Supreme Court with any real rigor. So I think there is at least some credence in the argument that we are not journalists, that we are, what I have dubbed in recent years, junior con law professors, and that what we're really, really interested is not the court, but in doctrine. And I often joke that you walk into the press office at the end of a big oral argument, and it can be an argument in which spectacularly weird conduct was happening on the bench, but what we tend to say to each other, because we're such wonks, is, oh my God, did you see what happened to the dormant commerce clause in there? Like, that's unbelievable. That's what we think our job is, to talk about doctrine. And I think, there's a term in Supreme Court coverage called the greenhouse effect, and it's predicated on the idea that justices would conform what they would write to make sure that Linda Greenhouse loved them. I actually think the real greenhouse effect is that because Linda has been such a spectacular parser of doctrine, we've all really tried to be that, and that is how we cover the court. And my years ago, I realized, and I said offhandedly, we tend to cover the Supreme Court as though the justices are alive and the justices are dead and constitutional doctrine is alive. And that's what we really report on, and we love it, and it's interesting and engaging. But I think it does mean that we leave a tremendous amount of space that no one else seems to be covering. So I think the criticism that we are just either scribes or wonky scholars is not entirely inapt. Maybe the best example of this came about a little bit before I came on the beat, when Tony Morrow, who's an amazing beat reporter who's been covering the court for a very long time, did a series of stories about minority and female law clerks and tried to figure out why the justices at the time overwhelmingly were only hiring white and male clerks. And the press corps kind of turned on him. And members of the court, press corps, were really, really happy to say on the record, this isn't a real story, this isn't our beat, this is just kind of gossip, and even said it, in ways that I think materially harmed Tony's reporting on that. And so I do think, just to be really clear, that we see ourselves as very different from congressional reporters. We are not, not that there ever would be a press conference where we could ask questions, but I often think even if there were a press conference, we would probably just limit ourselves to, nice tie, Chief Justice Roberts. May I compliment you on your tie? Because we really want to be in the room with them. And the paradox, and I think this has been pointed out on more than one occasion, but the paradox is, if you are very, very lucky, let's call them people A1 to 6, who actually get to eventually sit in a chambers and interview a justice, most likely, it has been my experience, even when I've had access, that you don't come away with a story. You come away with an exquisite ability to describe the carpet in their chambers, and they like to talk about their artwork, and then they'll show you their grandkids' drawings, but you will never get a kind of scoopy, juicy story. And so one of the paradoxes of this critique, that we're so beholden and we just want access, is that no matter how much access you get, you almost never get journalism from it. And that is also, I think, a fair critique and quite problematic. It is also the corollary to that little fact is that if you get access and you write something that the justice doesn't like, I think Jeff Rosen famously wrote something that Sandra Day O'Connor didn't like, you will never get access again. So if you accidentally commit journalism because you got access and the justice isn't pleased with what you've rendered, you will never get access again. So we're like gerbils on wheels trying to catch something that we can never quite get. I think the third critique, and I think this is actually becoming a growing problem, is that the justices themselves think that all we trade in is gossip and scandal. Now, I want to be super clear that the justices are the least interesting people in the world. And there's no gossips and scandal because they are just not people who are doing scandalous, gossipy things. And so I think it's always sort of strange to me that the justices really universally critique the press as being kind of embarrassing, gotcha, people who are trying to root out their deepest secrets, because we're not, because there are no deep secrets. And so I don't fully understand the critique that we are, shallow purveyors of gossip and titillating non-truths. It almost never happens because, as I said, we're just not interested. But really, I think that there has become a strand of what I would call kind of gossip-based journalism. And I think it is worrisome, and I think it's worth thinking about, and that is just this personality-driven cult journalism that has arisen, I think, in the last few years. And there are different flavors of that. There's the sort of Justice Scalia smackdown, as soon as he would say something at an oral argument, immediately the story would be to sort of hive off the little thing that he said that was scandalous, and that would go viral. And of course, I'm sure you've all seen that if, Ruth Bader Ginsburg so much as like lifts an eyebrow or, tips us off about her latest, Vitamix regime of what she's drinking, you can get 1 million hits just for, Ruth Bader Ginsburg crossed the street, and you will, I guarantee, get 1 million trillion hits, because I think the sort of cult worship of Justice's beat has become really, 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 for all sorts of reasons that we can talk about in the Q&A, but I think it's become the way to get clicks. And if the only way we as online journalists are going to monetize what we do, it will be because I know that if I write anything about, Elena Kagan's smacked down Neil Gorsuch in oral argument, or Sonia Sotomayor wrote a blistering dissent, those are the things that people read, those are the things that go viral. And so it's not gossip per se, I don't think it's gossip, but I think it's a distorted view of what justice is and who the justices are. And I do think that we're in a boom time for that kind of journalism, and I think it disserves the project that we are trying to be engaged in. So I think just my general sense of the beat is that it is still, I think, one of the most responsible, careful beats around, but I think that the critiques that I've offered for you, which is that we're either way too careful or way too reckless, there's a little bit of truth in both of those things. And I think that both of those things are starting to ramp up as the conversation around the Supreme Court gets more and more polemical and ugly. So what I think I need to explain now, and I know Keith Bybee has done better work on this than anyone, is just the paradox that we live in when we cover the US Supreme Court. But first I'm going to drink water because I'm thirsty. I think the paradox is very simple. We need to believe that the court is different. We need to believe that the court is not just another partisan political institution. And we need to believe that for the same reasons that I think judges and the justices need to believe that. A, because it's true, and B, because if it's not true, if everything is raw politics and power, then we're really wasting a lot of time talking about the Dormant Commerce Clause, because it doesn't matter. Nothing matters except 5-4. And there is an amazing imperative in journalism to push the story that it's all just politics. And since I've been covering the court, it has been an ongoing fight I've had with my editors because they always want to say, Judge such and such, appointed by George Bush, Republican, because that's shorthand for it's all just politics. And my instinct is always take that out, because I don't think it matters, and I think it sends the reader absolutely the wrong signal about what the courts do. So if you accept that the paradigm already is in journalism, that the courts are purely political and that's how people understand it, we take on the burden, which is I think the same burden that the justices have, which is to explain, no, it's not. It's not all politics. There's another thing going on. The justices are trying, for the most part, to triangulate against, doctrine, against the Constitution, and that we should credit that project because it's not just, a fake thing they do. It's, in fact, their work. And I think the justices clearly believe that, and it's one of the things on which you can hear Justice Breyer talk about it, Justice Kennedy, you can hear Justice Scalia, Justice Alito. They all really take seriously the proposition that this is not political, that this is different. And they will, all of them, say, look, yes, there are a lot of 5-4 hot-button cases. I interviewed Justice Kagan just last week in an open event, and she was careful to say, don't get focused on those 5-4 cases because most of our cases are 9-0 or 8-1. That's where the action is. Please don't call us, junior varsity politicians, as Justice Breyer calls it. And I think that the people who really feel as though they've been entrusted with the sacred work of proving that point are the press corps. We really feel that it is our job to push back on the narrative that this is all politics. And so I think in some ways we bend over backwards to make the opposite point. This is all doctrine. These people are just brains in vats. They are not politicians. Nothing political is happening here. And take your eyes off, the politics piece of this and let me talk to you like deeply and lovingly about First Amendment jurisprudence. And we really have, I think, enabled that, and I think we've also really bought into it. And I think that that's important because we're at a political moment right now where I think that is being blasted open. And I think Supreme Court reporters are in a really strange frame of mind where if my basic contention is true, which is that we all have just horrendous Patty Hearst syndrome, we believe that this institution, that has captured us and eaten up our lives and our brains is not pure politics, then it becomes the burden is on us to affirmatively push back against narratives about politics and dogma and doctrine. And I think that's the moment that we are finding ourselves in right now. And I can tell you, it is so profoundly uncomfortable for all of us. This has been, even these past few weeks, so fascinating to see how the Supreme Court press corps has faded back and allowed this to be a political story. And years ago I noticed, this is my 6th Supreme Court confirmation hearing that I've covered. I noticed that it was the case that newspapers don't send their Supreme Court reporters to confirmation hearings. They put us like in a bar somewhere with a pitcher, and they say, if our politics people have a question, they'll call you, but like nobody really cares what you think because this is a political story. And it is a political story. When people talk about, the majority whipping, whatever is, I have no idea. It's not my world. I don't live in the whipping world. I live in the world where, when Brett Kavanaugh talks about what he thinks about, administrative law, I can understand that. So we are not this story. And all of us now are sort of in this weird posture where we know a lot about the court, we know a lot about doctrine, we know what's going to happen, but we don't want to touch what is quickly becoming a really toxic political and partisan story about the Supreme Court. That narrative is anathema to us. It absolutely gets in the way of us doing our work. So I think part of this is just because the people who cover the Supreme Court really are not enterprise journalists. We're not trying to break stories. We are the most collegial press corps I've ever seen. The U.S. Supreme Court press corps basically named my children, and Jan Crawford told me where to get maternity clothes. And these are great collegial friends. There is almost no cutthroat competition here. But I think there's also really a long tradition of thinking that we are above this, that politics is something that is sordid and tawdry, and it's beneath us. And we pride ourselves on doing something other than that. And so I think this really begins to fall apart when you ask a Supreme Court reporter when they carbon date their nervous breakdown. It actually started the night Justice Scalia died, February of 2016. Because after the obligatory first round of press interviews and work on Justice Scalia's life and legacy, we had to position ourselves in what was a very, very strange conversation about whether Barack Obama was going to get to appoint his successor and how that was being blocked. And quickly, we realized that we didn't know how to talk about it because it was not our story. And so I think we went really silent. We did a diligent job that spring as the vacancy was held open. We covered the Little Sisters case, and we covered the unions case, but we did not, for the most part, weigh in on the political valence of the story. You may recall that when the court was down to 8 members and it was clear that the seat would be held open, Chuck Grassley stood in the well of the Senate and said, John Roberts had better not talk about this. This is not something that the court has to bother with. John Roberts is the reason the court has been turned into a political football, so he should be quiet, because if it weren't for John Roberts, we wouldn't be in this mess. And I thought, John Roberts, he's going to be really angry to be threatened from the well of the Senate, but of course, he wasn't. He said nothing. And none of the 8 justices for that spring and the following fall said anything. And in fact, eventually Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think, said in her, which is fighting words for Justice Ginsburg, 8 is not great, when she was trying to describe the following fall, how hard it was to do business when you're down to 8 justices. But I will say across the boards, Justice Breyer and Justice Alito were really at pains when they were asked in the fall of 2016, whether it was difficult to do their jobs with eight justices only. Both of them were at pains to say, no, it's fine, we can do this. The court has historically had 8. Justice Breyer went one better and said, they've done the business with just 6. We could do this with 6. Other people could die, and we'd be just fine. Don't look at us, because there's nothing partisan going on here. And that was a really, I think, bipartisan message that the justices were trying to convey. And they were trying to convey it precisely because we were heading into a massive election where the court was, for a lot of people, the #1 issue on the ballot. And their silence was the way they protected the integrity of the institution. But what it meant was that Supreme Court reporters were in the very, very unenviable position of sort of wanting to talk and think about this odd situation and leaving it to the political reporters to do it, because we didn't want to make the justices mad by suggesting this was a political problem. So what was fundamentally a court story morphed into a political story in 2016. And then we have sort of lived, I think, since there, in the Trump era of the Supreme Court, which has really been very different from anything we've ever seen before. And that's a story that has to do with the filling of the judicial vacancies. It's a story that has to do with how the Judiciary Committee has rejiggered the way it looks at the judiciary. But it's also a story, I think, that goes back to one of my criticisms of the way we do journalism right now, which is every once in a while a story would go viral. You know, look at this guy's in front of the Judiciary Committee and he doesn't know what, you know, the exclusionary rule is, and that, you know, little bit of video will go viral, but it actually has no enduring meaning. It's not an explication. It's kind of a very fun gotcha moment. But it didn't do anything, even though everyone saw, you know, and everyone saw the nominee for the district court who wouldn't say whether Brown v. Board was still binding precedent. But nothing about those clips going viral really explained anything about the judiciary or what judges do or what the Constitution is. And so we're in this sort of ugly gotcha moment, but we're not actually having a meaningful conversation, I don't think, about what the court is and how what the court does is maybe different from what other branches of government do. So I guess this brings us to the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, which has been like nothing I've ever seen in my life. I will say that the first iteration of the fighting was about process and documents, and that I was used to. I've done a lot of rounds on process and documents and people accusing each other of bad faith. And I also think that we did a creditable job in the press of trying to flesh out the really hard doctrinal issues around abortion, around executive power, around the administrative state, you know, genuine things that voters care about. And I think we did a good job on that. But when things blew up in the last 2 weeks, and I know I'm saying 2 weeks and you're thinking, no, Dahlia, it's been 500 years since I heard the name Christine Blasey Ford. But no, it's only been 2 weeks. But I think when things really blew up, the Supreme Court press corps was just spectacularly ill-equipped to talk and think about what had just gone on. So I want to just do one little detour in these remarks and just say that I think that, and I should just by way of disclosure tell you I was a bit of a part of the disclosure of Alex Kaczynski and the Me Too questions around him, and that was a very, very deeply uncomfortable thing for me to do as a journalist. It's like nothing I've ever done. But I will say, I think that that was the template for this Me Too in the judiciary explosion that we are now seeing this week. And I just want to be very clear that journalism is doing a really good job, I think, of smoking out systemic problems that are not getting smoked out in-house, you know, whether it's in Hollywood or in the media or at the courts. But journalism is doing it because institutions are not doing it themselves. And it is indisputable to me that the courts need to have better processes for figuring out what's going on. And I also want to be very, very clear, and I say this as a lawyer and someone who loves the law. Journalism is not a process. It is the beginning of a process. But journalism cannot do the kind of fact-finding that the law does. And so I think when journalism rushes into these stories, it's a good and useful exercise in smoking out things that are under the surface, but it is not necessarily a reasoned fact-finding proposition, and that's what we find ourselves in right now. We find ourselves in a moment where journalism has done all of the work, and some of it is good work and some of it is bad work, and we have two people who are making different claims, and now we're hashing it out in Dirksen 250 whatever for 5 hours yesterday, and that cannot be the way we do fact-finding, and yet that's where we are. So I think, you know, I am fond of saying my favorite constitutional quote comes from Homer Simpson, and he says of beer is both the cause of and solution to all of our problems. I would say exactly this. I actually said that in a speech last week when Anthony Kennedy was sitting right in front of me and he wrote it down. I was like, oh my God, what if I've given Anthony Kennedy like the greatest framing for, but then he retired. But I do think that journalism really is the cause of and solution to an awful lot of the problems that we are having as a society right now. And I think we have to be both very grateful for what journalism has done and also very, very aware of the pernicious effects of journalism that's not checked by other systems. And I think that is a little bit of what we saw happening yesterday. And I think the one other thing I want to talk about, and I don't say this with any agenda, is I think it's been really interesting to look at the case study of Ed Whelan, who is, I'm sure anyone who reads anything in the world of law and journalism in the courts knows that Ed has been, for decades, my entire career, one of the most thoughtful, careful, I may not agree with his outcomes, but the work he's done on the judiciary and on the courts and the law has been extraordinary. And the part he played in the Brett Kavanaugh train wreck of the last few weeks has been really, I think, an interesting marker for when journalism turns into something else that looks like political advocacy. And I think that that's a story that we have. I've noticed it didn't come up at all yesterday in the hearings. But I do think that that's a really interesting conversation we should be having about if we want our journalists to be very honest and transparent about which team they're on. That certainly happened in the last 2 weeks, and I don't think we've thought through the implications of that on journalism. I will say that an awful lot of journalists who I respect immensely, like Ross Douthat and David French, were retweeting Ed Whelan's defense of Judge Kavanaugh based only on the idea that Ed Whelan is a serious, thoughtful scholar. And that's, I think, the seam we're on right now, where we are really in peril of jeopardizing our own capital, decades of work, because we're trying to be in the trenches having these fights. So I think the last thing I want to say before I close is that it seems to me that what yesterday's events raised for me is the same question that is now facing the judiciary at the highest levels is facing the legal press, and that is, in effect, are we going to have to take sides? How are we going to say we do this lofty work and that what we do transcends politics and that judging is different when the entire thing has just cracked open in front of the nation and claims that this isn't about politics and this isn't about teams and this isn't about sides are being belied in the actual hearing room, in the actual confirmation hearings. And I will tell you, because I was one of, I don't know, there were 4 small tables of journalists in the room yesterday. Only 2 of us were Supreme Court reporters. Almost everyone was a political reporter. And that story is being told in, again, the realm of politics and not law. And I think that it was very difficult for those of us who have been claiming all along that law is different and the Constitution is different and courts are different to find our footing after yesterday's hearing. So I think we are just at a very, very dangerous moment where if you believe, as I do, that the sole legitimacy of the courts is public respect and public acceptance and tolerance for the proposition that this isn't raw power, that the courts are really different. If you believe that is true, we took a whacking stick to that proposition yesterday. And the people who need to figure out how they're going to think this through and talk about it aren't just judges. Certainly they're on the front lines of how we are going to talk about respect for the integrity of the court as an independent institution. But right behind them, I think, is a real phalanx of legal journalists who do not know what to do and say right now, because I can tell you I have never in my 20-year career seen anything like what went on in that chamber yesterday. And one of my sons texted me and said, first of all, are you okay? There's a lot of shouting on my TV. But the other thing he said, and I thought it was interesting, was, what are you going to say? And I don't know. I don't know what we're going to say, but I know we're going to have to say something, not just about this hearing, but the ones to come. And so I'm going to end and take questions, but I really want to leave you with this basic premise, which is I really do believe that one of the reasons Supreme Court reporters stay on this beat forever and love this beat. I mean, one thing is certainly that we get summer vacations, I won't lie. But I think and there are really, like, unless somebody dies, nothing happens. You can just cover the law, you can plan your life years in advance. But the real reason we do it is I think we have hook, line, and sinker fallen in love with this project, which is explaining that the courts are different, and explaining why that matters, and explaining why the rule of law, constitutional democracy, the independent judiciary are a cornerstone of what makes this country free. And I think that in the face of attacks on the press, attacks on the courts, conversations in which everything is stripped bare, we have two choices right now. One is to say, good, now we're being honest. The gloves are off, let's call it what it is. It's just bare-knuckle politics. And that's one choice. And I think, at least for some people, that's probably a tremendous relief. We're going to stop with the balls and strikes and the neutral umpire, and we're just going to call it as we see it. But I think that for those of us who cover the courts and are in love with that other narrative, that this is magic and it's different and it's thoughtful and it's careful and it's fact-based and it's reason-based, this is a really terrifying moment. And so, you know, we're going to have to pick our way through because that's what we do. But I would be lying if I said after yesterday that looks like it's seamless and easy. So I thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Yeah. Oh, wait, and I'm going to repeat your questions. I've been told I have to repeat your questions. There's no microphone.
So I was just curious, sort of, as you think about the rise or the continued prevalence of politics in the judiciary, when you look at something like the way the federal society has sort of risen in prominence and popular understanding in the last really few months, where in many ways there have been essentially the Republican Party has decided to outsource a part of their judicial search to this organization, which has a very specific set of, policy goals, for lack of a better understanding. How does that sort of narrative and that development shift your understanding of the interplay between the judiciary and the greater political atmosphere?
It's a great question. The question is, did everybody hear? Maybe I don't need to repeat it. No. Okay. The question is, one of the through lines in the past few months has really been the advent of the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation and other groups that are kind of right on the interstices of law and politics and the outsized influence they've had, and how does that play into this conversation? I actually think that's one of the things that I'm relieved that that's out there, because I think that machinery of grooming, young lawyers and picking, people and making sure they go to the right feeder judges, and I think that's something that has existed since I've been covering this beat, but it hasn't been a part of the beat. And so I think, that there was kind of a watershed moment when Jeff Toobin had a tremendous story last year about the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and the outsized influence they were having on judicial selection. For me, that's not problematic because those are facts that are in evidence. They've been in evidence, and we haven't made that clear because I think it does make judges nervous and it does make lawyers nervous that group has kind of hegemonic control. For me, I put that under good. Now we're talking about this because it's important and it exists. I think that there are still ways to talk about, and it's hard, but I think there are still ways to talk about the way Trump has selected judges and what those judges are that can be nonpartisan, that they can be, in the basket of what I call, constitutional doctrine. And I think that we've done a decent job of keeping it in that lane. But for me, I think opening up a world that was well known to anybody who has been watching, constitutional politics and judicial politics, opening it up so that we can actually talk about it and see what's inside, for me, I don't think undermines the larger project. I see that as something that is just true and that people ought to know about. So yes, it does raise the temperature on the politics end of this, but I also think it's been undergirding everything for a really long time. And I also think that the one really great thing that having a conversation about what Federalist Society and what Heritage and what ACS and what the other groups want in judges is that I do think it forces into the open a really useful conversation about what is a conservative judge, what is a liberal judge, beyond just the balls and strikes, strict construction, minimalist, humble, like those are not useful words. And so I think one thing that's been really helpful in seeing this larger conversation about what is it that unifies those judges on Donald Trump's shortlist, beyond just Federalist Society, but what are the values, what are the ideas that they're putting forward? I think it's so overdue to have a really deep conversation about judicial values. And so for me, if this is a vehicle to say, let's just talk about what it means, when you say somebody is an activist judge, because those words are utterly meaningless. So if we can talk about it and attach meaning and outcomes to that, I think that's a good thing. I think it's been really an impoverished conversation about, you get to a hearing and then you see, I feel like it could be a drinking game. Every time they say humble minimalist, drink. Every time they say balls and strikes, drink. Every time they say activist judge, drink. I mean, they're such casually thrown around words, but they stand as proxies for very meaningful legal ideas. And so for me, if we can get that into the discourse and we do it by way of talking about what this Federalist Society values, then for me that's a win, I think. Yeah.
Do you believe that the sitting justices have no input or at least any reaction to likely nominees?
I think they for sure have reactions. Oh, sorry. Do I believe that the current 8 sitting justices have input into or reactions to the nominee that comes up before the court? For sure they have reactions, because we all have reactions. I'm sure they talk about it quietly. I've been trying very hard to get the justices who talk to me to tell me what they think, and they're very diplomatic. I'm sure that they have very strong feelings, particularly in this case where they all know Judge Kavanaugh incredibly well because he's on the D.C. Circuit. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg's been doing Shakespeare opera stuff with him for years and years. I think that they all know him very well, and I think that they have very, very strong feelings about it. I don't think that they are necessarily pulling strings, behind the scenes. I know there was an idea that was floated, and I haven't been able to report it out, and nobody has, about whether Justice Kennedy retired because there was a promise that a former Kennedy clerk was coming in. I mean, I think there's certainly been whispers of that. There's also been whispers that one of the reasons Justice Gorsuch was the first pick was to mollify Justice Kennedy, that Trump was going to put up someone who was a sort of moderate right justice and not somebody who was going to be a bomb thrower. So I certainly think there are high-level conversations and discussions about it. It would be insane if they didn't have strong feelings about the next person that comes on. I can tell you, I really did, with all my colleagues, try to report out what conversations happened with Justice Kennedy in order to maybe make him believe that Kavanaugh was his. Nobody who I've spoken to is ever going to confirm or deny that for all the reasons we talked about, because justices are magic. Yeah.
In your role as a journalist, I'm wondering if, let's say, assuming that the nomination for Brett Kavanaugh goes through and he becomes a Supreme Court justice, what do you think you can do in your role as a journalist to just kind of help ease the passions that have kind of been on display over the last several weeks? Because there are going to be a lot of people, a lot of passion on both sides. So some will be really excited, some will be very worried. So what can you do in your role as a journalist to kind of put everybody at ease?
That's the question I didn't want. The question was, what is my role and responsibility as a journalist in the coming weeks, assuming that Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed, to take the temperature down on what has really become a very visceral, personal, roiling national debate. And it's the question I didn't want because I'm not sure. I think that one of the things that I did think was my job as a journalist when Donald Trump was running for office and he was attacking, Judge Curiel, and then he was attacking the panel of judges on the Ninth Circuit when they first struck down his travel ban. And I felt that my job as a journalist was to sort of bolster the idea that you can't attack individual judges, that, naming a judge in a tweet so that their children are walked to school with marshals, which is what happened to Judge Curiel, like that can't be a part of our discourse. And so I felt very, very committed to the proposition that I need to now be the ambassador between the court and the country to explain why we don't go after judges. And I did a lot of those columns, and my dad, who's the only person who read them, enjoyed them very much, because it's really boring, but I really believe that was my job. Now I think it's really tricky. I think that yesterday was tricky. And I say that knowing that you haven't read the piece I filed 10 minutes before I came in here, but I did. And it was pretty angry. I mean, I was pretty upset about what happened yesterday. And interestingly, a lot of my colleagues, literally last night, the texts that were flying around were, what do I say? Is it my job to take the temperature down and talk again about decorum and dignity and processes and norms? Or is it my job to say, oh my God, I was in a tiny hearing room, and when he was screaming, that really was, for me, quite chilling. So I think it's too soon. I think that this is going to play out, that we are really on the seam of a moment that I have never seen before, when you have actual nominees saying that the liberals and the press are colluding to ruin my life, and that the Republic is going to pay if I'm not confirmed, and alternatively Senate Democrats saying this nominee is evil. I mean, we're at a place that, and I covered, I wasn't a reporter for Anita Hill, I lived through Anita Hill, but I certainly covered Bush v. Gore. So I've been at these inflection points before where the whole country is looking to the court to tell us whether it's time to freak out or it's not time to freak out. And I appreciate, because it's a nuanced question, that now I almost feel as though it's not that I have to pick a team as between, the Democrats and the Republicans, but I have to pick a team about whether it's my job to take down the temperature and bolster the integrity of the courts, or whether it's my job to be kind of an honest broker of what I saw as a very, very frightening process in a lot of ways. And I don't know. I can tell you that at Slate, when Donald Trump was elected, we had about a month where we were editorially trying to figure out, what's our lane? Are we going to be kind of USA Today, he says, she says, are we going to be that? Or are we going to be, the Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness, and, that? And I think those questions about which team you're on in terms of advocating for norms, advocating for business as usual, or saying this is unprecedented and I have to call it what it is, that's probably, I don't know if any of my colleagues could give you a better answer than stay tuned. I don't know. I think I can take one more, is that right? Okay, one more, yeah.
So mine's about hypothetical, sort of.
Good.
So like, I guess, let's say 10 years from now, like, you know, there's 28th Amendment, and so it ends lifetime appointments to the bench. And so I was just wondering what that would do. I mean, like, so each president would have, like, you know, for a for one term, they get 2 appointments, or if they're, you know, get reelected, they get another one. And so there's this turnover, you know, so the person's on the bench for 12 years. I mean, a lot of these people are on the bench for 20, 30 years, you know, so there's a lot of stability in how, like, cases are go about, or how, I guess, you can report, because you know, like, how things might go. But I mean, if there's a lot of turnover over a course of, you know, I guess 12 years, like, there's always going to be someone on the bench, someone new during the 4 years. So I was just wondering how that would change, like, the profession that you're in right now.
So the question is whether if we ever get to the point where we amend the Constitution so that we term limit justices, so we have a much greater turnover, how it would change my job. I mean, the part of me that tells the story that it doesn't matter because justices are justices and that it's not people-driven says my job would be the same because, you know, you would replace one utterly fungible person with another fungible person who speaks, you know, on the phone regularly to Adams and to Jefferson, and so therefore it just doesn't matter at all. You know, because I think that's half the story, and the other half of the story is driven by who these people are and what they do. I think it would just mean a lot more sort of, you know, the kind of reporting of what we've done around Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, which is figure out who they are and what their record is and figure out what they bring to the court and figure out what happens going forward. I mean, I will say, you've probably heard Justice White used to have this expression where he would say, every time you get a new justice, you get an entirely new court. So it's not just that one person leaves and one person, the entire institution torques around that new person, and it takes a while, like quite a while. I think Justice Alito says a couple of years until you've kind of integrated and absorbed this new person organically. So I think that it would just mean a lot more of those stutter steps where the court reinvents itself, you know, every few years. I don't imagine, I mean, I guess I'd hopefully have to sit through not like this confirmation hearings a lot more often. I do think the confirmation process is utterly, irrevocably broken as it now exists, and that one of the things we are going to have to do is figure out how to do this in a way that is not blood sport. But I think as to your question, I think your job just becomes, you know, spending the summer reading somebody's entire record. I don't think we're ever going to, as a press corps, become a gotcha press corps. I think whatever else we you know, take on in our bailiwicks, I don't think we're ever going to be the people who are, you know, camped out at someone's job or home trying to get them to, you know, get on the record about sexual harassment. That's just not how we do it. So I think we'd just be reading a lot more law reviews and cases, but I don't think that we would become different people. I want to thank you so much for including me today, and